Johnson shot Small and then dismembered the body. Then a search of Johnson's Harlem apartment revealed the remainder of the body, the arms and the head inside of a freezer.
There's nothing to say. There's no words to describe that.
48-year-old Johnson is no stranger to the law. He was sentenced for attempted murder and robbery, spending over 20 years in prison. Since his release, he was working as a counselor to help at-risk youth at the Queens Public Defender's Office. Last month, he made an appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast.
And when I got out, I made a decision that I was going to walk away, and I didn't care about what the consequences was. And I said to myself, I've been doing bad for so long, I'm going to try to do something good. If all else fails, I could always go back to doing bad.
The first sound was a gunshot, then another, and then through the thin walls of a Bronx high-rise, a terrified voice broke through the silence. Please don't. I have a family. Those were the last known words of 44-year-old Colin Small, heard at roughly 1 in the morning on March 5th, 2024. Minutes later, more shots echoed through the 6th floor of a building in the Highbridge section of the Bronx. Then everything went quiet. For nearly 20 hours, no emergency crews arrived. No officers entered his home. No one checked on the man who'd begged for his life. But inside that apartment, something far worse than neighbors could imagine was unfolding. Something so brutal, so calculated, and so unnerving that when police finally entered, even experienced investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. Inside the small 6th-floor unit, officers found a man standing calmly in the living room. He told them Lieutenant Colin had gone upstate. But behind him, inside a blue plastic bin, was a headless torso and severed feet. And that man wasn't Colin. He was 48-year-old Sheldon Preston Johnson Jr., a former Bloods gang member. A man who had spent 25 years behind bars. A man celebrated in New York City as a symbol of redemption and criminal justice reform. A man who had been featured on podcasts and news programs as proof that rehabilitation was possible. And yet here he stood inside another man's apartment, surrounded by body parts later confirmed to be those of Colin Small. This is the case that stunned New York City, not just because of the violence, but because of what it revealed about trust, second chances, and the hidden histories that can turn deadly when no one is watching. This case isn't just about a killing. It's about a betrayal, a dual story of redemption and ruin, intertwined in a single Bronx apartment. In this episode, we're going to walk you through the minute-by-minute timeline of Colin's final hours. The shocking surveillance footage that captured the movements of the accused. The 9-hour delay between the welfare check request and the police response. The discovery of body parts not only in the Bronx apartment, but also inside a freezer in Harlem. The decades-long connection between Colin and Johnson. The unanswered question that still haunts this case. Why? This is not just the story of a killing. It's a story about America's complicated relationship with redemption, and how one man's public transformation collided with another man's quiet attempt to rebuild. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And do you believe this case was preventable? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your insight helps keep these stories visible. Welcome to the Crime Anatomy. And today we're dissecting one of the most disturbing homicide cases New York has seen in years. The killing and dismemberment of Colin Small, and the unraveling of the redemption narrative surrounding Sheldon Johnson. Before Colin Small became a headline, before his name was tied to one of the most chilling homicide cases in New York, he was simply a man trying to rebuild, a Bronx resident, a Harlem native, someone who had spent years fighting the gravity of his past while trying to carve out something quieter, steadier, and safer for himself. The world would learn his name because of the violence that ended his life. But the people who lived near him, they knew him differently. To them, Colin was the man who lived in the 6th-floor apartment of a Highbridge building. A man who kept himself, but wasn't unfriendly. A man who had done time and come home. Like thousands of men across the city who walked the narrow line between rebuilding and simply surviving. His story didn't begin with a crime scene. It began decades earlier in the streets of Harlem. Colin grew up in the 1980s and 90s, an era defined by economic hardship, community instability, and a criminal justice system that swallowed young men at alarming rates. His early encounters with the system would shape the trajectory of his adulthood. Eventually, he would serve a long prison sentence for felony assault, spending close to 10 years inside Sing Sing. A decade is a lifetime behind bars. It changes who you are. It carves into your routines, your fears, your habits, your expectations. But Colin's story didn't freeze inside those walls. When he was paroled in October 2018, he stepped back into Harlem determined to redirect his life. The details of how he navigated those first years outside aren't fully documented, but those closest to him, family and old friends, described him as someone who genuinely tried to move forward, someone who didn't want to go back, someone committed to rebuilding slowly, safely, and without drawing attention. Unlike the man later accused of killing him, Colin did not chase interviews, public platforms, or social applause. He wasn't on podcasts or working with organizations. His reintegration wasn't loud. It was patient. He moved to the Bronx. He kept his circle small. He lived quietly in that 6th-floor apartment. And he had a family when he cared enough about that in his final moments, when he believed he was about to die. He pleaded for the chance to stay alive for him. Please don't. I have a family. A single sentence that tells the truth of who he was long after the cameras left. Someone loved. Someone needed. Someone not ready to leave the people depending on him. One of the most important truths about this case, one the media didn't emphasize enough, is that Colin and the accused, Sheldon Johnson, weren't strangers. They weren't random acquaintances thrown together by circumstance. They had known each other for years. Some reports say since childhood. Others say they crossed paths inside prison. Most likely both are true. Harlem, the Bronx, Sing Sing. These worlds overlap. People leave, come back, go away again, and cross the same faces over and over across decades. Their histories run in parallel. Sometimes they collide. According to Colin's family, he even supported Johnson after Johnson's release in 2023. The nature of that support isn't fully detailed, but the implication is clear. Colin allowed him into his life, into his home, into his trust. You don't help someone you don't know. You don't invite someone into your apartment if you think they're dangerous. You don't open your door at 1 a.m. to a stranger. The tragedy of this case, at its core, begins with that trust. Despite his past, and maybe because of it, Colin tried to stay anchored. He wasn't perfect, and he'd never claimed to be. But he had something many people lose after long sentences. A willingness to keep trying. He wasn't a headline. He wasn't a symbol. He didn't want to be either. He was simply a man who had done his time and wanted a life with less chaos. One where he could rebuild without public judgment, without pressure, without pretending to be anything other than who he was. That's why the brutality of his death hit people so hard. Not just because of the violence, but because of everything he was quietly trying to protect and hold together. The plea for his life confirmed it. He wasn't thinking of himself. He was thinking of his family, whoever they were, wherever they were, whoever depended on him. And the fact that those final words were ignored, the fact that he begged and still suffered such a horrifying end, is what fuels the justified outrage of this case. Colin Small deserved better. He deserved time. He deserved safety. He deserved to open his front door without it becoming the last thing he ever did. Between 2023 and early 2024, Sheldon Johnson wasn't just reformed. He was promoted as a success story. Decorated public defender offices, podcast hosts, youth programs, and community advocates showcased him as living proof that transformation was possible. He had served 25 years of a 50-year sentence for attempted murder during robbery. And when he emerged, he stepped directly into the public eye. He spoke eloquently about redemption. He warned young people about gang life. He presented himself as someone who had become deeply introspective, deeply changed. Even major platforms gave him their microphones, hoping to amplify a rare, positive narrative about rehabilitation. But beneath this public persona lay a lifetime tangled in violence. As a child, he had been arrested for attacking a teacher, stabbing him and spraying him with a fire extinguisher. During his imprisonment, his own teenage son became entangled in a high-profile manslaughter case. And now, barely a year after his release, his life was again spiraling into violence, quietly, privately, and fatally. His rise wasn't smooth, it wasn't linear, and it wasn't what it seemed from the outside. In contrast to the public spotlight illuminating Johnson's redemption, Colin had chosen a path without cameras, without speeches, without applause. While one man became a symbol, the other just wanted peace. It begins calmly.
This is Johnson recently on Joe Rogan's podcast, talking about how he had turned his life around after a life of crime. He was working with troubled youth with the Queens Public Defender's Office. The shirt he is wearing says Queens Defenders.
I got into school, I got my GED. From there, I got involved in correspondence courses. I started interacting with guys who were teaching ART, aggression replacement training, and I started to begin to understand how these concepts work, what positive visualization is, deep breathing, how to remove yourself, conflict resolution.
Well, police say Johnson's life of crime apparently was not over. He is accused.
On March 4th, 2024, at about 10 p.m., surveillance footage shows Colin entering his sixth-floor apartment alone. He wears a specific outfit, later critical to the investigation. There's no sign of conflict, no forced entry, nothing unusual. But sometime after midnight, everything changes. A neighbor is jolted awake by the first 2 gunshots. Then she hears a man's voice, the last voice Colin ever used. "Please don't, I have a family." A pause, more shots. This is the moment where Colin's life ends. There are no further confirmed verbal exchanges after that. No chance of escape. No intervention from outside. The violence is immediate, chilling, and final. Because the official motive has not been released, and no police documentation clarifies what led to the shooting. This script will not speculate. What can be stated because it is documented is that prosecutors believe a fatal confrontation occurred inside the apartment. Whether it was an argument, a dispute, a long-building tension from their past, or something else entirely, remains unknown. But what happened next is not ambiguous. Minutes after Colin's death, Sheldon Johnson begins a series of actions that investigators describe as coordinated, deliberate, and chilling. The building's hallway cameras capture him moving in and out of the apartment repeatedly, throughout the night and into the next morning. Each time he appears, something is different. Different shirts, different hats, different disguises, and at one point a blonde wig. Then the cameras capture something even more disturbing. Sheldon walks down the hallway wearing the exact outfit Colin had been wearing earlier when he entered his apartment alive. This isn't speculation. This is confirmed through time-stamped surveillance comparison. Why would he wear Colin's clothing? Investigators believe it may have been an attempt to confuse anyone watching the cameras, to make it appear as if Colin was still alive, still walking in and out. A deliberate strategy to blur the timeline, to distort who was moving and when. It is one of the most chilling details in the case because it shows a level of awareness and intent that goes far beyond panic. While in and out of the unit, he is also seen carrying a blue plastic bin, cleaning supplies, various bags, and possibly items used to conceal or move remains. This is where the case evolves from a murder to something far more nightmarish. From after midnight until late morning on March 5th, Sheldon Johnson's movements are relentless. Surveillance cameras capture repeated entries into Colin's apartment, frequent outfit changes, trips in and out of camera view, carrying items consistent with cleanup, carrying the large blue bin that would later be found containing body parts. These aren't chaotic movements. They're methodical, calculated. They show a man who believed he had time and believed he could outmaneuver the systems watching him. And tragically, he did. At least for the next 20 hours, no help arrived for Colin. The dismemberment, the 9-hour police delay, the discovery inside the Harlem freezer, the charges, the public shock, the unraveling of a redemption narrative. This is where the story escalates from homicide to systemic failure to a collapse of public trust. What happened inside that Bronx apartment after Colin Small's final plea should have been impossible. A man begged for his life. A neighbor heard gunshots. The superintendent saw suspicious behavior on camera. Yet for nearly an entire day, no officer crossed the 6th-floor threshold. No emergency response arrived. No one intervened. That gap, those silent, unprotected hours, became a space in which a homicide escalated into something even darker. A calculated effort to erase the victim, manipulate surveillance, and scatter his remains across 2 boroughs. This is the timeline that should never have existed. Monday, March 4th. The building's hallway camera records 44-year-old Colin Small entering his apartment. Alone, calm, wearing the outfit that would later appear on another man. That footage becomes the baseline, the last confirmation that he was alive. At 1 a.m., a tenant jolts awake. 2 gunshots, then a pause, then Colin's voice. "Please don't. I have a family." Then 2 more shots. After those sounds, there's no more movement, no talking, no sounds of struggle, just silence. It is the moment Colin dies, the moment that should have triggered an immediate emergency response. But it didn't. The neighbor contacts the building's superintendent immediately. Concerned, he goes to review the hallway surveillance. What he sees is alarming. 1. A man repeatedly entering and exiting Colin's apartment. This man is later identified as 48-year-old Sheldon Johnson, the well-known criminal justice reform advocate. 2. Different outfits every time. A dark hoodie in one clip, a hat in another, a jacket changed moments later, and eventually a blonde wig. It is as if he's trying to become a different person every time he steps into the hallway. 3. Carrying items linked directly to a homicide cleanup. The superintendent sees Johnson with a blue plastic bin, a bag of cleaning supplies, additional bags, possible materials for concealment or transport. This isn't panicked behavior. This is methodical movement. For the most disturbing detail, Johnson appears wearing the exact same outfit Colin wore when he came home alive. This isn't coincidence. The timestamps show a deliberate attempt to blur identities. If anyone later reviewed only a portion of the footage, they might think Colin was still alive that morning. The superintendent, deeply disturbed, calls 911 at around 11:30 a.m. on March 5th. He explains, gunshots were heard. A man pleaded for his life. The camera shows suspicious movements. A tenant is missing or in danger. This should have triggered a priority response. Gunshots plus a plea for life equals immediate dispatch. But that's not what happened. Despite the call at 11:30 a.m., police do not conduct the welfare check until 8:25 p.m. that night. That's a gap of nearly 9 hours. 9 hours in which evidence could be destroyed, a suspect could flee, remains could be moved, a crime scene could be manipulated, a victim could have been dying. In a different case, a perpetrator could stay inside the home, undisturbed. In Colin's case, those hours were the window during which Sheldon Johnson allegedly dismembered Colin's body, cleaned parts of the apartment, transported remains to Harlem, returned multiple times, changed disguises, tried to fabricate a timeline, all without interruption. This delay is one of the most disturbing systemic failures in the entire case. When officers finally knock on the door of the 6th-floor apartment, the person who opens it is not Colin. It is Sheldon Johnson. Inside the apartment, officers immediately notice a strong chemical smell, disarray inconsistent with normal living conditions, items that appear out of place. Johnson reportedly tells officers that Colin has gone upstate. But the officers aren't satisfied. They move further inside, and that's when the truth emerges. When officers searched the apartment, they found a blue plastic bin, the same one seen on the surveillance cameras. Inside it, they discover a headless torso, severed feet, additional remains within the unit. Paramedics confirm this is no longer a wellness check. This is a homicide scene, brutal, deliberate, and unlike anything the responding officers expected when they walked in. Johnson is detained at the scene, calm, collected, and insisting upon his innocence. But the horror is not confined to the Bronx. Detectives obtain a warrant to search Johnson's Harlem residence on 5th Avenue. What they find there extends the brutality of the crime. Colin's head, both legs, one arm stored in a freezer. There is also concrete in Johnson's car, a Tyvek suit, often used to prevent contamination, indicators suggesting attempted concealment. These are not the actions of someone overwhelmed or impulsive. These are the steps of someone who believed he could erase a man and get away with it. This story does not end at the crime scene. it explodes outward into the legal system, the media, the public, and the question that still haunts investigators. Why? Why did this happen? What triggered the confrontation? And how could someone with a public platform built on redemption end up here? Those answers remain unknown, but the consequences are painfully clear. At this point in the story, what do you think the authorities should have done differently once the first gunshots were reported? Your insights help keep this case alive in public conversation. When the NYPD finally entered that sixth-floor apartment and discovered the mutilated remains of 44-year-old Colin Small, the case instantly became one of New York City's most disturbing homicide investigations in years. What followed was fast-moving multi-location police work, coupled with public confusion, disbelief, and a collapse of the redemption narrative that had followed the accused for months. As officers escorted 48-year-old Sheldon Johnson out of the building, cameras caught him making a single claim. He insisted he was innocent. But inside the apartment, and later inside his Harlem freezer, the evidence told a different story. A story investigators would later present in the courtroom. The evidence was overwhelming, physical, visual, and forensic.
He is the man alleged of committing a particularly heinous and evil crime, 48-year-old Sheldon Johnson, accused of killing a man and dismembering his body. But Johnson says they have the wrong man.
I'm innocent.
Victim's Bronx building.
It feels like the devil just crawled through here.
Johnson.
The medical examiner confirmed that Colin died from a single gunshot wound to the head, with bullet fragments recovered. Now there was no ambiguity, no window for misinterpretation, no way to hide behind public persona or polished interviews. A man celebrated as a criminal justice reform advocate was now the prime suspect in one of the most brutal killings New York had seen in years. Sheldon Johnson was formally charged with second-degree murder, manslaughter, concealment of a human corpse, criminal possession of a weapon. He was held without bail. There is still no confirmed motive publicly released. No explanation, no clarity on what sparked the fatal confrontation, and no narrative from investigators that goes beyond the facts of the night. For prosecutors, it was simple. A man who should have been alive was dead. A man trusted as a friend was accused of killing him, and surveillance, forensic evidence, and the condition of the crime scenes painted a chilling picture of what unfolded. Once the news broke that the suspect was the same man who had worked as a youth counselor, appeared on respected podcasts, advocated for criminal justice reform, publicly positioned himself as reformed, the public narrative shifted violently. This wasn't just a homicide story anymore. It became a conversation about trust, second chances, and the risk of elevating public figures whose private lives remain unmonitored. Reporters questioned how someone lauded as a symbol of rehabilitation could be involved in a killing this brutal, whether offices and organizations should have had stronger accountability or oversight, whether the public had been too quick to accept a polished redemption story, how to support re-entry in ways that prevent violent relapse, not just celebrate success stories on camera. It wasn't just a fall from grace. It was a collapse that sent shockwaves through criminal justice reform circles across New York. And through all of that noise, the danger became clear. The victim, Colin Small, was at risk of being overshadowed by the fame of the man accused of killing him.
Courtroom was filled with his supporters at his arraignment tonight, with one wearing a jacket reading, specializing in wrongful conviction cases. The executive director of his employer, the Queen's Defenders, also at court. They all declined comment. Now, Johnson nodded confidently at his supporters as he entered the courtroom. He's been charged with murder, manslaughter, and criminal possession of a weapon. The judge remanded him.
Colin's life mattered. His history mattered. His attempt to rebuild mattered. He was a man who had done his time, come home, and tried to reconstruct a life in a city that rarely gives people like him clean, easy opportunities. What remains at the end of this story is Colin's plea. 14 words. A man fighting to live for the people he loved. Please don't. I have a family. This will forever be the human core of this case. The reason it matters. The reason his name deserves to be remembered beyond sensational coverage. What do you believe this case reveals about redemption, accountability, and community safety? This has been the Crime Anatomy. We document the failures so we can build the fixes. If this story affected you, Take a moment. Share it. Talk about it. Let's start conversations that save lives. Subscribe for more in-depth investigations. Turn on notifications. And share your thoughts in the comments.